Welcome to today's podcast, where we'll be diving into U.S. foreign policy and trade relations. Whether you're a student of international relations, an enthusiast of global politics, or just curious about how the world's largest economy interacts with the rest of the globe, this episode is for you. We'll explore recent trends in U.S. trade, the delicate balancing act of diplomacy, and what it means for the future of global markets. Let's get started. Let's begin with an overview. U.S. foreign policy and trade relations have long been a topic of debate and discussion. The United States is a superpower with a vast influence on global markets, politics, and security. From its economic strategies to military alliances, the U.S. plays a pivotal role in shaping the world's geopolitical landscape. But it's not without its challenges. In recent years, we've seen a shift toward more protectionist measures, particularly under former President Trump's administration. His America First slogan wasn't just a slogan, it was a guiding principle for his foreign policy and trade tactics. We saw this in the form of tariffs, trade wars, and a re-evaluation of international agreements like NAFTA, which was replaced with the USMCA under Trump's leadership. But with the Biden administration, there's been a shift toward multilateralism and diplomacy. The U.S. has re-engaged with international organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, the United Nations, and even the Paris Climate Agreement, all of which were initially abandoned or sidelined by the previous administration. One of the most critical aspects of U.S. trade relations in recent years has been its relationship with China. Over the past decade, China has emerged as the U.S.'s largest trading partner, but this relationship has become increasingly complex. Let's break it down. Under President Trump, we saw an all-out trade war with China. He imposed tariffs on billions of dollars of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and a trade deficit. In response, China retaliated with tariffs of its own on U.S. exports, including soybeans, aircraft, and automobiles. These tariffs created tension not just between the two countries but also impacted global supply chains. In January 2020, both sides signed the Phase 1 trade deal, in which China agreed to purchase more U.S. goods, including agricultural products. But the underlying issues, such as intellectual property rights and forced technology transfers, were left largely unaddressed. Now, under the Biden administration, we've seen a continuation of some of these policies, though there's an emphasis on collaboration in areas like climate change and global health. The U.S. is still wary of China's growing economic influence, especially in Africa and the Pacific Islands. While the trade war has cooled, the U.S.-China relationship remains tense, particularly when it comes to technology, cybersecurity, and human rights. Now, let's turn our attention to some of the global trade agreements and how the U.S. is interacting with them today. One of the most significant changes in recent years was the replacement of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The Trump administration argued that NAFTA was outdated and not benefiting the U.S. economy. With the new USMCA, the U.S. sought to secure better trade terms with both Canada and Mexico. The USMCA includes provisions aimed at reducing trade deficits, improving labor rights in Mexico, and addressing intellectual property concerns. For example, it gives U.S. farmers greater access to Canada's dairy market, and it increases the requirements for automobile manufacturing to ensure that a larger portion of car components are made in North America. But while the USMCA has been touted as a win for the U.S., there's ongoing debate about whether it will actually lead to significant improvements in the U.S. economy or job market. Trade relations with Canada and Mexico remain vital, and the new agreement has had mixed results. In addition to the USMCA, the U.S. has been engaging in various free trade agreements with countries around the world. The U.S.-Japan trade deal, for example, saw both countries reducing tariffs on agricultural and industrial goods. And in the Asia-Pacific region, the U.S. has shown interest in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, a trade bloc that includes Australia, Japan, and other nations. While the Biden administration hasn't fully embraced joining the CPTPP, it is looking for ways to counter China's growing economic influence in the region, which is why these trade relationships remain crucial. As we mentioned earlier, the U.S. has been active in using tariffs as a tool of foreign policy, especially under President Trump's leadership. But the question remains, do tariffs work? Let's explore the impact of tariffs and trade wars. Tariffs are often used by governments to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, but they can also lead to unintended consequences. For example, the trade war with China led to higher prices for consumers on products like electronics, clothes, and even food. U.S. farmers, particularly those who exported goods to China, were hit hard as a result of retaliatory tariffs. One of the most notable consequences of the trade war was the disruption of global supply chains. Companies that relied on Chinese manufacturing had to find alternative suppliers, which increased costs. The shift also prompted many companies to rethink their global supply chains, with some moving production to other countries in Southeast Asia. However, tariffs didn't just affect China. U.S. tariffs were also applied to steel and aluminum imports from Europe, Canada, and Mexico. This sparked a diplomatic crisis, particularly with Canada, one of the U.S.'s closest allies. While the tariffs were eventually removed, the tensions they caused still linger. While tariffs can be an effective short-term tool to protect domestic industries, they often lead to higher prices for consumers and hurt industries that rely on imports. This raises the question of whether trade wars are worth the economic disruption they cause. So, what does the future of U.S. foreign policy and trade relations look like? First, it's important to note that U.S. trade policy will likely remain an ongoing balancing act. While President Biden's administration has sought to stabilize relations with traditional allies and re-engage in multilateral diplomacy, it's still clear that the U.S. is wary of China's growing economic and geopolitical influence. Going forward, the U.S. will likely continue to focus on strategic competition with China, while also forging stronger ties with other nations in the Indo-Pacific region. Additionally, there will be increasing pressure to address global supply chain issues, especially in critical sectors like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and energy. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, and countries are increasingly focused on self-sufficiency in key industries. This will play a big role in shaping future trade policies. Climate change will also be a significant factor in shaping U.S. trade policy. The Biden administration is prioritizing environmental sustainability, and this is likely to affect trade agreements in the future. Expect to see more emphasis on green technologies, renewable energy, and carbon reduction strategies in future trade deals. Finally, U.S. foreign policy will increasingly need to adapt to a multipolar world. As other nations, including China, India, and the European Union, rise to challenge U.S. dominance, the U.S. will need to continue refining its diplomatic strategy to maintain its global leadership role. That wraps up today's podcast on U.S. foreign policy and trade relations. We've covered a lot, from the complexities of U.S.-China trade relations to the future of global supply chains and the impact of tariffs. As always, the world of geopolitics is constantly evolving, and it will be interesting to see how U.S. policy adapts over the coming years. Thank you for tuning in, and if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. We'll be back soon with more discussions on global politics, trade, and foreign policy. Until next time, take care and stay informed.